hello everybody. Thanks for being here. I know we're at the end of CES and we're trying to get through it, but I appreciate you taking the time to be here. And then thanks to VR First for sponsoring me to be here. That's well appreciated. Just so I know, who here has, just quick hands up, who here has worked in VR or is working in VR? Okay, and then who hasn't worked in VR? Who didn't put up their hands? See a few at the back. This isn't going to be a technical presentation. I want to talk about sort of game design best practices and then by extension how they apply to VR. Because a lot of this is, I would argue, well understood. And if I'm honest as a designer, kind of nobody is an expert of VR best practices right now. We're trying to sort of spread what we know and learn from each other. The key to success, though, is definitely to learn these best practices quickly so that the early adopters can spread the word and then VR can take off. If the shared experience is poor, then the devices can have a much lower possibility of success. And let's be honest, I mean, historically, and by historically I mean pre-2012, which is a funny definition of historically, VR has been largely a failure. It's only now that we've sort of got this opportunity via better hardware to find success. So these are the outcomes for the talk that I want to cover, and then covering questions or whatnot as those arise. So what are the good design principles that lead to good user experience? How can you learn to use failure well? And by extension kind of violate player expectations when appropriate. That's a good thing usually, violating player expectations. What's the state of the market? Should you invest in VR? And then more generally, where are we headed? So I'm from Vancouver, up in Canada, just a little bit north of Seattle. Normally I say, don't worry about it, Vancouver's the place where there's no snow, but right now there actually is a foot of snow in Vancouver, so I would be totally lying. About 5 years ago, my wife and we had a child, and I needed a nice 9-to-5 job, so I started work at VFS. I'm still properly in games, though, as a consultant and designer. I'm currently working with the resurrected THQ on some mobile products that they recently released. Now, luckily for VFS generally, and myself in particular, we're one of the schools that's working with VR First, and they have indeed helped us a great deal, supplying us with devices. Before we worked with them, we had exactly 2 devices on the campus, so we were right on the button for that, kind of 50 students for every device in our department. And now we're a much more generous ratio. I think we're 11-to-1 right now, which is fantastic. Okay, so how difficult is it to develop games for VR? The answer is, it's not, right? Most game engines, Unity, Unreal, Crytek, are almost plug and play, right? Typically, it's just a simple setup to enable VR output. The only real kind of gotcha, all told, is with Oculus, which has, let's just say, kind of finicky hardware requirements. And this actually did set us back during our initial rollout. But we've worked through that, so we're now kind of building our proper VR lab. The difficult parts of working with VR games are sort of the design of the product and then the kind of competing hardware out in the market right now, trying to figure out like what to develop for or developing for everything simultaneously. The worst thing you can do while working in VR is trying to force successful existing product lines into VR. I won't say names, but there was a game company I know about that was recently killed, a mid-sized game company. They were a mobile company. They, I would say, neglected their primary revenue streams and did a very heavy investment in VR. And then as a result, they sort of found themselves in a pinch and went out of business. So you should be only developing VR games that work best on VR, right? Just ask the simple question, if this game is on a big screen in front of you, is it a better experience? If so, then it shouldn't be a VR game. But this trend to sort of push games, shall we say, like previous technologies games onto new platforms isn't a new trend, right? We saw this in mobile phones. Pre-iPhone, mobile gaming was almost like Soviet in its simplicity. Like you would contact a company and you'd say, we're working on a role-playing game. And the company would say, oh, we already have a role-playing game, so thank you, we don't need another one, right? Apple obviously just completely blew that up. But the established game companies, and these are multi-billion-dollar organizations, by and large weren't the first ones to find success on mobile gaming, right? It was largely smaller outsider groups that were the first to find success in mobile, the first to use the hardware correctly. If you want a great example of using hardware correctly, there's a mobile game right here I recommend to everybody in the room called Space Team. It's a free game, so you can download it right now. And if you play it, it's a brilliant game. It will only work on a mobile device, right? Like you can't put it on another platform. Now, if we go sort of back in time a bit to VR, this is sort of the closest thing I consider anyways to like a near successful VR product, I suppose, the old Virtua Boy. It's a almost hilarious product to consider today because it literally damaged your eyes. You could only play it for 30 minutes before built-in timers would switch it off, right? Now, okay, we can laugh about that. It is sort of related to a problem with VR gaming today, though, right? In that VR devices, by and large, are quite inelegant. You know, I kind of jokingly call it the heavy hat problem, right? How long are you willing to see a loved one wear one of these large devices on their head before you ask them to take it off? Now, everybody in this room knows, of course, that 2012 rolls around and the Oculus Rift Kickstarter happens and sort of explodes public interest in VR. Their Kickstarter campaign of $2 million was considered just absolutely astounding. Sort of funny, though, to consider that from an investor's standpoint, $2 million is a laughably small number, but by Kickstarter terms, it was fantastic. And then it had this kind of almost ludicrous array of industry backers behind it, including Gabe Newell from Valve. Gabe's an almost like religious figure amongst gamers. Gamers will literally pray to him during games of Dota 2. And what you got from that Kickstarter promised a lot of things, or at least alluded to a lot of things. It promised to be a transformative experience to the user. It promised to let you step inside your favorite games. That was actually straight from their Kickstarter. And it promised to be kind of about, I would say, one gaming console in relative cost, right? Like it promised to be very, very pick-upable by the average consumer. In fact, this is what that average cost got you, right? It got you a development kit, a copy of Doom 3, a t-shirt, a poster, all sorts of funny stuff thrown in here. And the price is, adjusted for today's dollar, almost exactly what I just paid for a PS4 bundle before Christmas. Right, so unsurprisingly, people just exploded. Here's that lineup of names that pledged support immediately, right? So John Carmack, Cliffy B from Epic, the CEO of Unity, Gabe Newell, all sorts of people. Now, Valve wanted to get in VR immediately, but when Oculus was purchased from Facebook, they had to change tack and they started to develop the HTC, the Vive, that is to say. The Vive is my favorite device by far. The controllers that you hold give you sort of unbelievable fidelity in games. And it solves some of the design issues. It throws up kind of barriers in-game if the player has walked too far, for example. But then as a developer, how can I recommend to a company that you should only develop for the Vive? Obviously that's too small a market to have a chance for success. Products like Google Cardboard get brought up a lot. From the gaming standpoint, I tend to think of Google Cardboard as sort of like a gateway drug for VR gaming. Most people who buy one of these things, or are given one of these things, end up then wanting a full VR console themselves, which suggests to me there's possibility for like small cardboard experiences that then lead into proper VR product. As a developer, the one I'm most interested in right now is actually the HoloLens. I like the way it's maintaining that connection to the real world. It's a much more friendly user experience generally. And I like that suggestion of elegance to the product, right? It's stepping away from sort of that heavy hat problem. Luckily for me, a lot of HoloLens development's going on in Vancouver. We met with Microsoft's Director of Innovation recently, Eduardo de Martin, and he really wants to make Vancouver kind of the center for HoloLens development and by extension HoloLens gaming. And I try to mention like my excitement about this sort of thing because I'm in no way a naysayer about VR gaming. I think it's very much analogous with success of Napster isn't the right word, but the attention Napster got, and the way that at least it proved that there was this market in place for digital music distribution, a market which today is the only market that really matters. Okay, so now let's think a bit about how to actually make a good game on a VR platform. The complex enemy, and then complex enemies with simple rules. And these kind of loops of failure get stacked on top of each other. And the best games, I'd argue, understand this, and they reinforce those failures. There was a driving franchise called Burnout, which had some success on console for some years. And then for this iteration of the game, they discovered that, well, if failures need to be fun, let's make the failures just fantastic. So here you don't just crash, Like your whole car explodes in front of you, and you can control the car during the crash. This idea is actually like a really, really old one that's sort of like a game needs to be about entertaining failures. These are some old pen and paper RPGs I used to play. I'd be surprised if anybody in this room has ever played them. But in them, the players kind of negotiate a story with somebody acting as a storyteller. And some of my best memories as a gamer are in the elaborate failures I was forced to undergo playing these games. You know, I was shot out of cannons, killed by my own clones, driven insane, all sorts of craziness. It probably sounds, you know, sadistic, but they're actually like fantastic experiences. So if, you know, these failures and magnificent ones are kind of the first point of good game design, the second is user expectations, right? Because we don't design in a vacuum. We're always fulfilling user expectations or violating them in interesting ways. So take shooting, right? There's been thousands of shooting games at this point and millions of people who know how to play a shooting game. So if a user puts a reticule over somebody, they presume that if I click the button, then that bad guy is going to fall over dead. You know, I don't have to teach them how to shoot. But then I make a sniper game that has, you know, realistic shooting physics in the sniper game. And suddenly I need to teach the user that their bullet's going to fall short. I need to teach them about, you know, the Coriolis effect, and I need to teach them about like dealing with wind as they take their shot. I pay a heavy user experience cost, but in exchange I stand out from the market of other shooting games, and I maybe find success. I mention sniper games on purpose because I just shipped a sniper game on mobile, and we've got this sort of like live discussion right now as to should this be a VR game or not, right? As it happens, the answer is probably no, because this is a free-to-play game and sort of the monetization strategy doesn't nicely fit VR unless we redid the whole design. Another example of kind of expectations in games and violating them. These are RPG icons, and you know, if you don't recognize the icons, there's millions of gamers that do. They know exactly what each one of these icons means. And then I, as a designer, I don't need to spend any time teaching them what these icons mean. But then I switch games. That little musical note above that cat's head is also a quest icon, right? And the user probably doesn't know that. They probably are intrigued by it, though, and they'll talk to that character. And then they will have sort of self-explained themselves this new way. And have also, again, stood out from the market of traditional RPGs. I've found a way to find success. Because if there's no violations in a product, then there's no opportunity. So if you look for, you know, strategy games in the Google Play Store, you'll see something like this. You'll see a rack of you know, Clash of Clans clones. And which one does the user download and play? Well, the one with the biggest marketing budget, probably. So if you're, you know, violating rules in your VR experience, and I hope you are, you need to aim for a self-explaining system of some type. You have to embrace and reinforce your failures, and the failures have to feel fair. It has to feel like, you know, the failure was a result of the user's actions. And then the violations should reinforce the theme of the game, right? So a sniper game with realistic physics, I think, reinforces the theme. Advertisers have known this for a long, long time, right? That you can either fulfill expectations or violate expectations. So if I want to sell beer in America, the sort of fulfilling expectations version is that image right there. You know, it's loud, it's brash, it makes a lot of noise, and it sells a lot of beer. But so does this image, right? And it couldn't be any more different, but it's violating that expectation of beer advertising, and it's doing really, really well. Here's my favorite example of kind of violations in game design. It's an old Nintendo GameCube game called Eternal Darkness. And it's got sort of RPG standard stuff. There's health and there's mana, and there's also sanity. You know, you can go insane while playing this game. And in theory, you would try to not go insane. In practice, you would make yourself go insane as quickly as possible because it was fantastic. You know, the game would play with your camera, perhaps, which again is something that's considered almost sacred in game design, so that's a surprising violation. Or it would change who you're controlling, so now you're controlling a monster attacking a good guy. Or it would pretend to delete your save games, like it's doing on the example on the right. My favorite violation from this game is I'm playing it and I'm loving it, and suddenly the sound cuts out and the TV says mute in the bottom left corner. So I start feeling around because I'm like, oh no, I sat on my remote, right? And then the sound comes back and I realize I haven't owned a TV that says mute since like 1989, right? But the game's completely fooled me and it's made me fall in love with it. But you don't violate people's expectations constantly, right? Because violating expectations has that cost I talked about. And VR has this real problem. It's created this new set of player expectations. And it's also afforded us the ability to violate them in new ways, but we're not really dealing with the cost elegantly. Like one of the solutions right now to deal with the problem of nausea in VR is just to root the player in place, make them travel along a rail, put them on a magic carpet, things like this. And until hardware solves that problem for us, that's largely where we're set. So the player expects to be able to move, and then we tell them they can't. Generally, when you're doing VR design, you do something like this, right? This is what board game companies are doing this day in the mobile world. They're trying to say, okay, what can we change about the product? What must we change about the product? What's kind of that sacred core that we have to maintain to keep the player base intrigued? And then what new things can we do with this? This is a really big deal with companies like, say, Ravensburger in Germany right now, because they're sitting on this fantastic intellectual property, but they're scared that if they move it to mobile or VR or something like this, they'll now cost themselves the physical sale. Here's my favorite VR game currently. I think it's an amazing VR game. I recommend it to anybody interested in VR, called Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes. It's a very funny game. The idea is there's one person who's got the VR headset on, and only they can see a bomb. And he has to describe the bomb to the people outside the game who have a paper manual, and they tell him how to disarm the bomb. So it's simple, it's brilliant, and it only works on VR. If you play it on a big screen, it's just not fun anymore, right? And as a result, I recommend it to everybody interested in this. Over at VFS, of course, one of the things we're always thinking about is like, should student projects get pushed to VR, right? Here's a successful student project we had called Pulse. It's a game that's all about echolocation and being blind. So the player is literally blind from moment to moment. It sounds like a very interesting case for VR here. The player can only see when like some sort of sound has occurred in the world. But experimentation proved that it just wasn't that satisfying for VR, right? The user could walk anywhere they wanted, and the bulk of the gameplay was platformer-based, so it just didn't work in VR. Whereas here's another game that was done as a student project. I should point out, Pulse is a retail project. They did a Kickstarter and got it sold. So they invested, sort of proper time and energy in it. Certainty Condition is another student project we did that it's a puzzle game, and it succeeds as a VR game because it keeps the user sort of at arm's length from the puzzles of the world, right? And as a result, they can't create all sorts of cognitive dissonance problems they'd otherwise have by putting their camera 2 inches from a puzzle in the game. All right, so VR generally has many problems we're trying to address. There's nausea, and nausea right now we're fixing through design, but some of these solutions to me seem sort of inelegant, right? The fact that you are disconnected from the real world, the cables, imagine designing some sort of game or product where you were only allowed to move the mouse left a certain number of times, right? That's literally a problem we have with VR development right now. The price point, which is still very high, and the fact that there is a lot of low-quality product out there in VR, too much, I'd say. This is why kind of the smart market for VR right now is just a handful of things. The first and largest of these is still simulation of whatever type, because the simulation market is used to paying a high cost for these sorts of experiences, right? They're used to paying this high cost to get a safe way to fail real-world actions and further their training or education. The market's small, but you plan accordingly as a company. People expected sort of mobile-like explosions of hardware deployment back in 2012, and that just didn't happen. And I think the best guess for that deployment is 3 to 4 years. But there are, still areas of success. Hopefully we can touch on some of these in the panel. Things that there's opportunity for both kind of investment and product success in the market today. And that's it. And I hope you visit Vancouver someday when we don't have a foot of snow on the ground. Okay, thank you. Okay, there we go. Okay. There you go. Okay.
Panasonic.